Good evening, everybody. How are you? My name is Scott. Welcome to Bethany Church. This is our midweek study. So glad that you are here. A question for you. How many of you have ever been misunderstood? That's one of my greatest frustrations, is to be misunderstood. To try to communicate something, maybe it's via email, maybe it's even in a conversation, and not be understood for what I'm trying to communicate. Not even just the content, but even the tone. It's such a difficult thing to be able to communicate at times. Hopefully I'm actually communicating it now. Whenever I think about that, as far as a moment or a person being greatly misunderstood, one of the first biblical characters that comes to mind is John the Baptist. John the Baptist was the cousin of Jesus, just by a couple months the senior to Jesus, pretty much tracking the same time frame as you flip from Old Testament into New Testament. And John the Baptist had an incredibly specific ministry to prepare the way for the Lord, to make level paths straight, to fill in the gaps, to cut away everything that would impede someone to find now Jesus coming as the Messiah, carving out truly a new and living way. John the Baptist was greatly misunderstood by his volume, by how he communicated, his appearance, his ministry, his mission, all of that greatly misunderstood. And deeper into his own life, after he has been preaching that Jesus is coming, he's baptizing followers of Jesus, followers of this way, John the Baptist finds himself in prison. And at that moment, he sends word to Jesus via his disciples or his followers. This is where we pick up in the story in Luke chapter 7, beginning with verse 18. Would you look with me? Also, a reminder that you can find that not only in the scriptures, but also on our app. We have a couple fill-ins for you throughout tonight's teaching. But let's jump in together. Luke chapter 7, beginning with verse 18. John the Baptist's disciples told him about all these things. Calling two of them, he sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" When the men came to Jesus, they said, "John the Baptist sent us to you to ask this question. Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" Now, a rhetorical question right at the outset. Didn't John the Baptist already know who Jesus truly was? Not just based upon my introducing it tonight, you probably have a working knowledge of his role, his ministry. And this is fairly deep into the ministry of Jesus. It's then fairly deep into the ministry of John the Baptist. And yet he brings this question via his disciples. Didn't he already know who he was, though? Didn't he know him relationally as a cousin? Didn't he set the timeline regarding baptism? Wasn't there already some type of an existing relationship commensurate with that baptism and the fact that, well, they're cousins, they're related? And then wasn't there an aspect of revelation that's what preceded the very ministry of John the Baptist, that he knew why he was here. He knew definitively his calling. So why later on would he ask this question? Does this actually show doubt? And to a certain extent, yes, it does. But here's where Luke doesn't help us with this flow. I gave a hint at it a moment ago. Luke doesn't, for whatever reason. And you have to go back to what Matthew says about the flow of what's taking place. Matthew, that parallel passage, tells us that John the Baptist is in prison. So you and I need to just back off because he has some doubts because he's in prison. Now, come on, think about it. How many of you have had certain times when some freedoms have been taken from you, or some discouragement has risen, some difficulty is all around you, start to become a little despondent or dismayed, maybe even depressed internally, and you start to wonder, maybe you're not entirely wondering, is Jesus really who he is, but where is he? Where is he in the whole part of the story? Like, you know where he is globally, universally, but in your jail cell, right where you're living, you start to wonder, where is he? And if you camp out there for a while, you can have some doubt. And that's really what's happening with John the Baptist. Maybe not a faith crisis, but there's enough of a curiosity or intrigue from where he sits in prison that he sends his disciples to ask Jesus, Are you truly the Messiah? Are you who you say you are? And are you who I've been preaching about? I've been preaching, make level paths. I'm baptizing people in your name. Are you truly him? Because I find myself in prison as my reward for doing so. Are you actually there? Came across this great simple quote, but I think it's profound nonetheless. David Guzik says it this way: our discouraging circumstances often cause us to forget or doubt who Jesus is. Maybe you're not entirely doubting, although you can have that and still have faith, but maybe you just forget. Maybe you haven't seen him move in your own life in a while, and you go back to some chapters and verses, and you remember what he has done previously in your own life or around you, but for right where you are, the circumstances are speaking louder than the Messiah over your life. Let's pick back up at verse 21. At that very time, right at that period of time, Jesus cured many who had diseases, sicknesses, evil spirits, gave sight to many who were blind. So he replies to those messengers that John the Baptist sent. Go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. And here's what it is, Jesus says. The blind receive sight. The lame walk. Those who have leprosy cleanse. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. And the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. And he speaks right into John's life via the messengers to say this. Listen, I know where I am and where you are. It feels like it's not connected. But don't stumble because of where I am. It is not the end of your story. And I need you to pause on that, my friends that are listening right now. It wasn't the end of the story for John, although it would be a different ending than what he probably was expecting or what he thought he was signing up for. And so in your life, you may find that there are some places. Is Jesus really who he says he is? Is he really one of presence? Is he really one of power? You may have heard that he heals, but when's the last time he's healed you? When are some moments that you've really seen the supernatural hand, heart, touch of Jesus over your life? And if it's been a while, it can cause you to just kind of go, You might forget, you might doubt, you might begin to ponder a little bit. And I think this is part of what Jesus is saying, that in our own lives we need to verify and we need to testify that he is still who he says he is. And if we haven't seen him come around the bend for a while, it doesn't mean that he has stopped being, Jesus. And when we see that he is verifying, then we testify as to who he is. I equate so much to sports. If you know me, you know that I'm a baseball fan, specifically coming from the greater Philadelphia region, a big Philadelphia Phillies fan. And I'm missing baseball right now. We'd be about 50, 60 games into the season. We'd be beginning to see the positioning of which teams are good and which teams are bad. And I'd probably be very frustrated with my Phillies if they were actually playing baseball right now. I don't know if you know this, but the Philadelphia Phillies franchise is the losingest franchise in all of professional sports. A few years ago, they eclipsed the very notorious milestone of 10,000 losses as an organization. Congratulations, Phillies! They literally are the losingest franchise in all of sports. But I'm a fan. And if anyone speaks up about the Yankees or the Mets, I will shout them down or I will testify to being a fan of the Phillies. And there are times that I don't know the way that the story's going to go. That in my lifetime, we won in 1980 and we won in 2008. And yes, I said we. But more often than not, it's losses more than wins. But I'm a fan. I verify who they are and I testify to that I'm still a fan. But I know that more often than not, I might lose even more than I would win. But you and I are aligned to Jesus, who is the ultimate winner. And although you might have some losses along the way, you and I verify that he is who he is, and we testify to his greatness, and we testify, we speak up, we leverage the moments that we have to be able to declare he is still worth proclaiming. He is still the miracle worker. He is still healer. And we need to gather those stories. We need to remind ourselves. We need to collectively part of a community of people that will verify and testify that he is still Messiah, Jesus, Savior, healer, Redeemer. It's who he is. And so I dare you, especially if you're a sports fan, or if you're a fan of certain genres or styles or bands, then if you're quick to testify about them, then would you be quick to testify about your Lord? And it might spark or awaken something within you as you rehearse and remember. It'll cause the doubts and the forgetfulness to dissipate and the remembrance to elevate within your life. Jesus says it this way, blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. So here's a rhetorical question for you tonight, my friends. Which better describes you? That Jesus is one that you stumble over or that you step into? It can only be one or the other. When you see him, do you step in? Or is there a stumbling aspect to who he is that you're not exactly sure? The present circumstances can cause us to feel doubt and forgetfulness more than faith and remembrance. And so here's John, and he's in a jail cell, and it's almost as if he's saying, great list, Jesus, but how about when the prisoners go free? You didn't have that in your list. You might be feeling the same thing, my friends. That from where you are, God feels, it seems distant. And I dare you to hang on to what God wants to do within your life. Verse 24. After John's messengers left, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear expensive clothes and indulge in luxury, they're in palaces. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. Here's what comes back to John being misunderstood. John, to a certain extent, is like the one that a couple years ago went and visited Southern California, and we took our children to Hollywood Boulevard, and it's not a real pleasant place. And I still have in my memory one gentleman on the street corner preaching about Jesus. And his voice was just faint in the wind. He was loud, but the louder he got, it was as if people tuned him out. And I think John, to a certain extent, had that about him, that there were some that weren't able to cut through the noise of what he shared. And the more that he shared, the more he was misunderstood. But then there were some that if they're really listening to the message and able to separate what was going on the outside, they'd get to the message of what was taking place. You see, John the Baptist was the last and the greatest prophet. And he was able to be that, to that generation and really be the last and the greatest prophet because he's able to declare in that time frame that Jesus had already come. This is the one about whom it is written. Jesus is still sharing this about John the Baptist, one who was greatly misunderstood. I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you. I tell you, among those born of women, there is none greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he. Jesus quotes directly from the Old Testament, one of the last verses in the Old Testament, that Old Covenant, from Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1. As a preamble to that, you have the close of Malachi 2 and verse 17. It says, we have wearied you, Lord, with our words. And I wonder sometimes that we try to talk ourselves into belief. We try to work up an aspect of faith or courage. And we might speak it, and it might help remembering for a short amount of time, but are we really owning it? Is it internalized as a message within our lives? Is it deep-seated within us? And it's as if Jesus is trying to remind those within the sound of his voice that he is trying to have the people rather remember who John the Baptist was, why he actually had come. And so one of the things that Jesus is pointing out is this, that no one greater has been born, mainly because he had the privilege of saying of the Messiah, of Jesus himself, here he is, instead of he is coming. He's the only one that was able to do that. Everybody else would foretell who he was, and John was able to point to him, that he was already there. An incredible privilege. And so John the Baptist really, to a certain extent, this is probably a crude way to say it, but John the Baptist to a certain extent was the hype man for Jesus. He's the forerunner, this is the biblical way to say it. He was out in advance of Jesus, clearing the way so that people would be able to find him. He was, to a certain extent, the Hollywood Boulevard preacher, and some would tune him out, and some would go, but there's something of essence, there's something of truth that's there. Cut away all of the cacophony and the distractions to get to the message. That's what John the Baptist's role was. Here, Jesus reverses it. And he, in some respect, is like the hype man for John the Baptist. He reminds those that would listen regarding the specific ministry of John the Baptist. He furthers the renown of God himself. And he furthers the mission by trumpeting the message and the ministry of John the Baptist. And I don't know how you would look at this, but John the Baptist would have the end of his life soon thereafter. It's John chapter 12 into 14 that begin to tell us the end of days for John the Baptist. He will be beheaded in just this awful game, really, in Herod's family, just this terrible demise of John the Baptist. But he finished well. He was able to run his course. He may not have finished the way that he wanted, but he'll ever be remembered as the last and the greatest prophet who would clear the way for Messiah Jesus. It has been said of you and I that now that Jesus is going to prepare a place for us, now one of our ministries, one of our responsibilities and privileges is to continue to clear the way for now the risen Lord, for the Messiah who has come and will come soon as the conquering one. He'll come to take us up out of this place. And we now become the modern day prophets that would declare the way for the risen Lord. They would fling wide the gates so that the King of Glory might come in. You and I now take up that mantle of the ministry of John the Baptist. And I love this. This is so good. And this is an interesting final testimony or testament to the life and the ministry of John the Baptist. Verse 29. All the people, even the tax collectors, when they heard Jesus' words, acknowledged that God's way was right because they had been baptized by John. So let me just pause there for a moment. Jesus reminds them, what I'm telling you is not new information. John already was out in front of what I'm saying. I'm just calling you back to it. I'm reminding you. Because all these things that are surrounding you, all these things are now surrounding John, ironically. I'm going to remind you of the life, the message, the ministry, the mission of John the Baptist. I call you back to that. And in that moment, there's this intellectual remembrance, but more so, there's a spiritual, emotional, and mental remembrance. We've heard this before. The way of God was right. We had been baptized. We had heard his message and his ministry. Thank you for calling us back to it. And there's some of you today, you might need to get called back to your first love. Get called back to being on mission. Called back to that it's not about you. It's about those that are still far from God. That you and I still have the mission of making level paths, of cutting away all the debris so that others can simply, easily, obviously find Jesus as the Savior of the world. Come on, I hope you haven't forgotten that. I hope you haven't given up on that by mission and by prayer. And so it says, all the people, even the tax collectors, just, that's right. And verse 30 has this incredible shift. But the Pharisees and the experts in the law rejected God's purposes for themselves because they had not been baptized by John. So the pagans, the tax collectors, show the epitome of it. Even the tax collectors, the worst of the worst. The pagans, they humbled themselves. The Pharisees, the teachers, and the keepers of the law, they exalted themselves. Where do you most identify today? So Jesus went on to say, picking up at verse 31, to what then can I compare the people of this generation? What are they like? They're like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to each other. We played the pipe for you and you did not dance. We sang a dirge and you did not cry. Verse 33. For John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, but you would say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. He's talking about himself, Jesus, at this point. Son of Man came eating and drinking by contrast. And you say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. We can't win, is what Jesus is saying, at least in the moment, in the here and now. What will please you, dear listener? Verse 35, but wisdom is proved right by all her children. Now watch this. Jesus is pointing this out. John the Baptist, he fasted among you. He denied himself. In this moment, he'll have his eternal reward. But you say he had a demon because he was just too out there, too different. Come on, John the Baptist, get off the street corner. Come on, come back to some normalcy and some sanity. Jesus, feasting, and you say he's a glutton. So which way will please you? Alexander McLaren, a great Bible commentator, said it this way. If the message is unwelcome, nothing that the messenger can say or do will be right. Can I ask you one more rhetorical question in your life today? I've been asking myself this as I've been writing this over the last few days. Do you focus more on an outward look or an inward look? An outward look in judging, predetermining other people based upon what you see in them. If they're fasting or if they're feasting, what their appearance is like. Is there a pageantry to them? And you go, I'm attracted to what's on the outside of who they are. Or maybe even in your own life that you're trying to have this projection of image. And so you want others to view you outwardly because that's how you view other people. And you think that's the leading entity. That which you see first, the outward, is also the finish. Or will you look at things from more of a lasting and spiritual standpoint of what's going on in the inner workings of your own life, as well as what's going on in other people's lives? Maybe another way to say it is, are you and I more worried about on stage or off stage? Are we more worried about the spotlight or backstage? Which is more appealing to us? And I wonder how many times we quickly judge other people by appearances, by what it looks like, and we might dismiss them, rather than it's an inward working, and it's the delineation between haughtiness and humbleness, or better said, in correct grammar, humility. Finally, would you contrast verse 31 and 35 with me? For Jesus is making an interesting point. He's saying, all of you are worried about this generation, that which will last, that which you can see, the appearances, all which seems to make sense in the here and now. You can understand it. But I'm about the things that at first glance might be misunderstood, like Jesus' own mission, John the Baptist's mission in advance of. But if you really grasp it, and you grasp the things that are unseen and inward and eternal, and, well, if you grasp those things, then it's about the next generation. Are you about just this generation, what's best for us now, or for the next generation? It's one of the questions we're trying to figure out even as we make a determination whether to physically reopen church. Is it about my generation, my preferences? Or is it about the next generations, leaving a legacy? Is it about what I prefer and my rights for now, what I can see? Or is it about something that I've yet to see that God is doing in a spiritual realm? Which is it going to be? Am I about my generation or the next generation? All this study reminded me of an admittedly very old worship song. Old in that it was written in the early to mid-90s. There's a great worship band by the name of Delirious. Martin Smith, their lead worshiper, is one of my favorites in leading people into worship. I'll editorialize just for a moment. I happened to see them lead worship at a corporate gathering for a youth ministry conference more than 20 years ago. And I'm watching and I'm worshiping, and I loved the way that they would communicate via music and just feel like you would be ushered into the presence of God. And I looked up after a while and I realized I didn't see Martin Smith, the lead worshiper. I go, Where is he? I can still hear him, but I didn't see him. I'm looking across the stage, and he's all the way in the back of the stage on his knees, virtually unseen. It was more about the inward than the outward. More about what God wanted to do that would further God's renown rather than his own. It wasn't about leveraging a moment for his glory. It was about leveraging the very power of God and his renown. Always been moved by that moment. Just this incredible time in the presence of God where I was reminded it is not about us. It's about God's glory working in and through us to further his praise, his glory, and his renown. And so, one of the songs that I think is so profound that they wrote years and years ago is called Lead Me. And I'd encourage you to take a quiet moment and just take the opportunity to just worship. Let that song be a prayer of, I wrote it in your notes, a prayer of confession, of consecration, and direction. For you and I have been invited to be the people that will continue to carry the mantle of prepare the way for the risen Lord. God bless you all. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have an incredible rest of the week. Can't wait to see you soon. Bye-bye.